Good morning. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. Today is Friday, July the 12th, 2024. And with me this morning is well-known lawyer, author, blogger, Virginia LaTorre-Jeker. And we are going to have a brief discussion about matters of public interest, which were introduced in her recent Forbes article. So, Virginia, how are you today?
Hey, John, I'm doing very well. How are you?
I am fine. I'm looking forward to this topic. So, what was the title of the article in Forbes?
Okay, the title of the article was Tax Return Preparers' Mistakes or Fraud. Innocent Taxpayer Takes the Hit.
Yes. So, my God, I mean, there's been all this focus over the years on taxpayer mistakes, taxpayer doing this or that. And if that isn't bad enough, there are instances where taxpayers are helped along by the conduct of their tax preparer, right?
Yes, but unfortunately, they're unwittingly helped along. The taxpayer doesn't really even have any clue what the tax return preparer has done. And that's the sad part of it all.
And that's, of course, I would think, a very, very heightened problem for Americans abroad whose lives are in a currency other than the US dollar, who not only are dealing with a more complex US system, but perhaps have less understanding of it. I mean, would you say that they're generally more susceptible to this type of thing?
I would agree, yes, absolutely, because you will probably get a taxpayer living and working overseas who has been struggling to find proper tax help. That'll be the first thing. So a lot of times they will find, okay, gee, I got someone who says he knows how to do this, and the price is fairly reasonable, and they'll go on and just be kind of grateful they found someone to handle their tax returns, which are a bit more complicated than the stateside taxpayer. So you have that. There's that issue of kind of panic that they don't have anybody. Then I think, as you point out, the returns are going to be far more complicated. The currencies will be different. The tax reporting will be different, perhaps from the country where they are living to the United States. And all of these additional complexities give the fraudulent or ill-prepared tax return preparer kind of a soothing balm to tell the taxpayer, oh, this is why this doesn't look right to you, because, we have different currency exchange rates and we have different reporting rules from your Australian tax return to your US return. And if, you're just an innocent, normal taxpayer, you're going to believe that person because they have the expertise that you so desperately need, or so you believe.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it also is complicated by, over the years, people have asked, well, what's the right exchange rate to use? And even for US returns, I mean, there are different exchange rates for different purposes, throughout the thing. So, I mean, it seems to me it's just a combination and a compounding of complexity that makes it very, very hard for the average taxpayer to understand what's going on. So you would agree with that as well, right?
Yes, I agree. And I think that helps set the stage for them being kind of entrapped by a return preparer who either doesn't know what he's doing or knows what he's doing and is being fraudulent in how he's preparing the return. And just so the person's listening to this can understand, gee, why would someone do that? A lot of times the return preparer who is not on the up and up will say, well, you know what? Our fee will be dependent on the percentage of the refund you get. And so that, of course, incentivizes the return preparer to exaggerate, if not completely make up certain deductions and so forth, because then the refund will be greater.
Right. So, yeah, at a bare minimum, I think anybody who, who's even aware of arithmetic would understand that the lower the income and the higher the deductions, the greater the refund, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So, I mean, on a basic level, I mean, I think it's reasonable to not understand a U.S. tax return. I think that's fine. But it is important when looking at these numbers to say, hey, does this make sense? Bearing in mind that it's going to look different because of the exchange rates, right?
That's right. That's right. And a clue when you are looking at that return and seeing if it makes sense, if you feel it doesn't make sense and you start asking the return preparer about it and they get very aggressive in their response, that's a clue that something's off. Okay. That's a real clue. So people should be very aware of that fact. If your tax return preparer is not taking the time to explain things to you, at least attempting to explain things to you and comes off with, well, I'm the expert and you got to trust me, that's a sign that something is not right.
Yeah. Now let's talk sort of briefly about the notion of reasonable cause and what it can do for people. I mean, it's not going to reduce the amount of tax owing or anything like that, but it surely would have some bearing on penalties, right?
Generally, yes, John, that's correct. I would say there's no way a taxpayer is going to get away with paying tax due and interest owed on the tax due, regardless of, the preparer's fraud or negligence, etc. You're always going to have to pay that. What you want to not pay, hopefully by establishing you have reasonable cause for the tax noncompliance, are the penalties associated with the mistakes and the missing forms or whatever it is that's happened with your return.
Okay. So maybe if it's possible to keep it sort of brief and to the point, for a taxpayer to establish reasonable cause, I mean, it's not like they can say, well, I gave everything to this tax preparer. More than that is required. There's some due diligence required on the part of the taxpayer, I think, in selecting a tax preparer, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we have Treasury regulations that flat out say reliance on the professional may not be reasonable or in good faith if the taxpayer knew or reasonably should have known that the advisor lacked knowledge in the relevant aspects of the tax law. So they're holding you to a pretty strict standard before you're going to be able to establish reasonable.
So, I mean, at a minimum, there's an obligation on the taxpayer to take steps to satisfy himself or herself that, hey, this is somebody with experience in international information returns or, with taxpayers from this country. Would that make sense?
Yes, they definitely need to be looking at who their tax return preparer is and what are their credentials and what makes them competent to prepare this kind of return that involves maybe foreign corporations that you own or whatever.
Okay, but to that, should we add activities in the particular country they live in?
I think that gets harder and harder, John. I really do, because depending on where you live, there may not be a U.S. tax professional that can handle your kind of return.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, it's certainly difficult, but the bottom line is that what people need to understand is they cannot say, well, I found a tax preparer, I assume this person's competent, right?
That's right. Can't say that.
So they're going to have to do some work. So there's the issue of who is being hired to do the work, but then you mentioned the issue of who the taxpayer is. Is it reasonable for a taxpayer of this profile to be accepting that this particular taxpayer is competent to do this return, right? Have I put it accurately?
Oh, absolutely. That's correct. I mean, if the taxpayer has a financial background and, is well educated, he's going to be held to a much higher standard than someone that, let's say, doesn't have any of those expertise factors behind him.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
have
So,
many successful businessmen that don't have that kind of experience with financial statements and so forth. They're just
oh,
relying on
absolutely.
everyone else to run their run their show. And they've just made great contacts and have the gift of gab and charm and bring in the money. So you have to look carefully. Just because someone is a business owner doesn't necessarily mean they are the same as someone else that might have an expertise in understanding financial type matters.
Yeah, to put it very, very simply, there's nothing about running a business successfully that means that you have any expertise in anything beyond that business.
Correct. I would say that's a good way to put it.
Okay. All right. So, sort of segmenting these things off. So, the reasonable cause is an issue with the penalties. But of course, if you have somebody advertising, I'm an international tax expert, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that I'd rather have that than not. Agreed?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Well, we've got the other problem of this. I mean, let's say that the tax preparer has understated income, overstated deductions, etc. And let's imagine that you believe as a taxpayer that you're in that situation, that a return has been prepared with substantial inaccuracies in it that affects the tax that you owe to the government. I think obviously meaning that you would owe more or you should have paid more. What would you advise a taxpayer to do in a situation like that?
Okay, so I think first of all, that taxpayer needs to get someone to really understand all of the facts as to what has happened. And it is, there's a lot of pertinent issues. For example, has the return preparer been picked up by the IRS and is he being prosecuted? Because if that is the case, then that taxpayer needs to understand he's far more likely to be audited because now that person has signed his tax returns. Okay. So that's the first thing. The need to take action may be more urgent in that kind of situation. Once we understand what's missing from the return, how much income wasn't reported or how many deductions were taken and so forth and so on that don't belong there, then you have to say, okay, so what do we do? Do we have a statute of limitations issue? How many years are still open? And that can be a very complicated question depending on the facts, because you have different statute of limitation rules for different kinds of mistakes or errors.
Could you give me an example of different statute of limitations rule? For example, perhaps if foreign income were involved or
Okay, so if you are missing a foreign information return, such as a Form 8938 or 5471 dealing with ownership of certain foreign assets, then the statute of limitations clock never starts to tick. It doesn't start. And your tax return year will always remain open until the IRS gets that particular foreign information return. And once it gets it, you have a 3-year statute of limitations applying, but the entire return remains open under that 3-year statute, not just the issue of, gee, I had an unreported foreign whatever mutual fund. So that is one example. Another example might be if there's been a substantial understatement of income, then the statute of limitations goes on for 6 years until the IRS can come after you. It's as opposed to the normal general 3-year statute of limitations rule. And there's a special rule as well. If income is missing based on a foreign financial asset, you'll have another extended statute of limitations rule applying. So there's all different sorts of rules that apply. I think for the most part, your client should be assuming, I've got a problem and statute of limitations is probably not going to help me. What do I do now? And then we look at, okay, how do we fix these errors? Can we possibly maybe use one of the IRS initiatives where we won't be penalized? And if not, can we think about perhaps making a reasonable cause argument that we have reasonable cause for forgiving the penalties that might otherwise be due?
Okay.
So,
Can
yeah,
I, can I just, can I just pause you there for a second? I want to make sure that your earlier point that I believe you're making, correct me if I'm wrong, comes through clearly, that the fact that for international taxpayers that this is foreign income tied into it is likely to have an effect on the limitation period, correct?
yes, yes.
Okay, so that's the first point. That's the bad news. But the good news, just sort of listening to your continuation from there, is that streamlined is probably an option, isn't it?
I would think it is because you have to say your tax non-compliance was non-willful, which means, it could be attributable to negligence, misunderstanding,
Inadvertent.
inadvertence. Now, again, the IRS has found willfulness based on this issue of willful blindness. Okay. So if you should have known something was off and you didn't investigate further and you kind of turned your head and looked the other way, then you will not be eligible for streamline because you may be deemed to have had willful tax noncompliance. So you really need a professional to guide you through this because, as I mentioned earlier, if your tax return preparer has been picked up by the IRS, and we've recently had an international one who is now being charged with, I think it's over 30 counts of tax fraud, then you're more likely to be audited. And they're going to be looking very carefully if someone like you goes into streamlined. So, yeah.
Well, but so
Not
streamlined, just thinking out loud. I
You
mean,
have to be very
streamlining.
cautious.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
streamline includes a statement of non-willfulness. And, I would have to think that at a minimum, the statement of non-willfulness would include that, I retained this tax preparer and I learned recently that there were problems with these returns, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's generally, I think, going to be a helpful fact on the statement of non-willfulness.
Of course, John, of course. And I think we're kind of running out of time. I would just say the facts have to be so carefully looked at because
Oh, absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
mentioned, oh my gosh, these tax returns don't bear any resemblance to the reality of the taxpayer's situation. That's going to be tough for you to get reasonable cause. Like, what do you mean you had 13 dependents? You don't have any.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's
Right.
type.
So
Yeah.
we don't know what the return preparer has done. And if you've just blithely signed your tax return, oh, I didn't really read it. It was thousands of pages long. Well, that's not going to fly.
Yeah, except unfortunately, that's exactly what people do.
I know, but I'm just saying.
Yeah. Now I understood. Okay. Well, at a bare minimum, if people find themselves in this situation and are concerned, the sooner this is dealt with, the better. Yes.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a painful, anxiety inducing topic to be sure if anybody's listening. But the way I think to deal with this is not to be frozen in fear, but move forward in understanding and just get the problem solved, right?
That's the best advice. And I know sometimes it's very difficult for taxpayers to do that because that is, we have the deer in the headlights kind of syndrome.
Yeah.
And we freeze. So, yeah.
Well, maybe put it another way, sure, they're the ones with the incorrect returns, but often they're not the ones who are really at fault here either.
That's right.
So I think that's important to understand. Okay, they're stuck with the problem, but it's not necessarily a problem they're making, and they're not the ones who are at fault. Putting it in the best possible light, putting a bad situation in the best possible light, I guess, Virginia. All right.
It's your way, John, which is lovely. I would just say that this Forbes article has been reproduced on my website, so people can read that one because it was posted earlier this month, July 3. So people can find that one on www.us-tax.org, and it's called Tax Return Preparers Mistakes or Fraud. Innocent Taxpayer Takes the Hit. So.
And I absolutely would recommend reading that article. Actually, I would recommend reading all Virginia's articles. As Virginia knows, we haven't done a podcast for a while, but I remember years ago, British Airways had an ad, the world's favorite airline. I've always thought of Virginia, the world's favorite tax lawyer.
Oh, well, that's a real compliment. Thank you, John.
Well,
to it.
It's a great blog. And I recommend it to everybody. All right. Well, thanks for this brief chat this morning. I'm not sure, I think it's about 6 a.m. and I'm starting a very, very busy day. So I've got to get moving, but thank you again so much for this.
You're welcome, John. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Okay.